Furious is the response of Dunedin academic Janine Hayward to the government's lack of response to calls for changes to MMP. The government has come under fire after throwing out Electoral Commission recommendations to amend the MMP system. That followed Justice Minister Judith Collins' announcement changes would not be in place before the next election. Associate Professor Janine Hayward joins us to explain her response. Good evening, Janine.
Good evening.
Tell us a little bit about the background to this issue.
So the background was that a number of years ago the government implemented a electoral reform process, and that included a referendum at the last general election and then subsequently a review of MMP, and it set the time frame and the mandate and all the information that was needed for that review process, and it said when that had to be delivered. So the public got involved. There was a big education campaign to get people understanding the issues. They voted in the referendum. They chose to keep MMP, and then they got engaged in that review process in all kinds of ways, made submissions, went to meetings, held meetings, all kinds of things.
What's happened in the last few days?
So the recommendations were delivered at the end of last year, and nothing really has happened since then. And then just in the last few days, a question was put to the Minister of Justice. She was asked whether she was going to bring those recommendations into the House, put them into legislation in time for the next election, and she said no.
What is it that's raised your dander about the issue?
Well, my dander is up about this issue for a couple of reasons, really. The first is that I'm really frustrated that this review process has basically been stalled by self-interested politicians at this point. But the other thing that makes me cross about it is that really the purpose of this whole thing is to try and engage public. It's really hard to get the public engaged. It's hard enough to get people to vote, and if governments are going to dismiss this kind of process that easily, it could really damage our democracy.
Now, Judith Collins has said that there was a lack of consensus on the changes, and it's not her job to form consensus. How do you respond to those comments?
Well, I mean, that's, I think, I've heard lots of excuses, frankly, recently, in the last few days from politicians, all kinds of excuses about why nothing can happen now.
Now, you have some views on who should make decisions on the electoral system. Tell us about those.
Well, they're fairly widely held views. I mean, it really should be voters. This is the electoral system is for voters. That's the point of it. It's not for the politicians and political parties. And the National Party knew that. That's why it put the referendum and review process in place, and rightly so. The problem is now, the flaw in the system, is that ultimately this is coming back to the politicians now to decide, and they don't seem able to set that self-interest aside and think about what voters have said to them.
Where would you like to see the issue go from here?
Well, I would like to see the politicians set that self-interest aside, think about what the review said, what the recommendations were, and bring them to Parliament.
Realistically, where do you think it'll go?
Well, realistically, I don't think it's going to go away. I think there's all kinds of ways that this will continue to be a problem for the government. And, frankly, I would encourage all voters to keep pressure on their MPs and whoever they can influence to make this issue, to keep this issue alive and get it into Parliament where it belongs.
Why do you think that they said no?
Well, I just don't think it suits their interests. But, you then wonder what on earth the point of the whole process was. There was an enormous amount of time and energy and resources and effort put into it. If the government was never going to take it seriously, then it really was wasted effort. And that makes me cross enough. But in the long term, it concerns me that when we're asked to do this again, people simply won't bother.
Associate Professor Janine Hayward, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.